and very happy to have Julian Vayne here, who's an expert in chaos magic and other things. I'll leave you to introduce yourself, I think, because you know what you know. But thanks very much.
Okay.
Yeah.
Oh, look, here we are. Come, don't sit there. Come closer. Come closer. Look, because we didn't do the bloody thing because we need a wire and it probably wouldn't work and all that sort of stuff. So that we're coming into the winter time. We're coming around fire. We're coming for a little story. I'm going to tell you a few stories. Thank you very much for inviting me. That was very good. Well done. That was very good. It's like hard to do at the front, because at the front you get picked on for the question, don't you? It's like, no, you don't get picked on at the front. Everyone knows it's the next row back. Oh, everyone knows that. Quickly If you've ever been to school and sat in rows on desks, then you know the architecture of the space. And they do that thing where they call, what do they call it? They call it pose, poise, and pounce. So blah blah blah. What's the question? Pregnant moment. You boy! That's how it works. Anyway, I'm not going to do any of that. Listen, I'm going to go on for, I don't know, like 40 minutes until you sort of start to glaze over. And then I'll go a bit longer just to really make it purr. And then I'll probably stop. So thank you for inviting me along this evening. I thought I would talk about drugs and magic, basically, because that's one of the things that I'm particularly interested in. Earlier on this year, I released this thing, which I'm very, very proud about. You know, I've written various bits and bobs, but this is the one I really like. This one, I think I like to think I've done quite a good job. Partly I've done a good job because I've worked with lots of other really interesting and nice people. So the artist Pete Loveday, who's a sort of, some people might remember as an underground comic artist from the sort of 80s, 90s, still working, he's up in North Devon. These lovely sort of illustrations through the text, lots of little things. But basically this book, Getting Higher, is all about the relationship between drugs, substances that can change our awareness, and magic, and the sorts of things that I guess all of us are really interested in. And the thing is that when we think about magic, we have to think about stuff like, the witch's cauldron. Where would the witch be without her cauldron? And in the cauldron, there's weird stuff floating around, bobbing around in that cauldron. And where would the alchemist be without their alembic flask with magical material in it, the philosopher's stone, something that will transmute base metal lead into alchemical gold? And where, of course, would shamanism be without substances and techniques that change consciousness? Now, of course, when we think about, for the purposes of this sort of discussion or this conversation, because I'd like people, if you have particular thoughts, throw them out as we're kind of going through this. We might have some time for questions at the end. If we think about shamanism, we can think about the kind of ways of changing consciousness we can see happening in this image. So we can talk about drumming, and we know that drumming, music, dance, all of those things, they change the way our physiology works, the way our bodies work. So a simple example of this is if you have a choir of people and you get them all to sing, from the same proverbial hymn sheet, what will happen is you have what's entrainment of brainwaves, and you have synchronization of breathing, of course, because they're all singing the words in the same way. You have synchronization of their brains. So you can change not just an individual person's consciousness, but change it in context of the group. And shamanism, and there are lots of discussions we can have about what is a shaman. My personal definition is the shaman is the person with the funny hat who has the drugs. That's my definition of the shaman. And the drugs can be physical stuff. So in the context of, say, Siberian shamanism, we're usually talking about things like amanita. So we're talking about that lovely, the mushroom that we have all of our associations of fairy lore and magic with. We might be talking about things like psilocybin mushrooms and things as well. And of course when we go to South America, the kinds of shamanism, although that's a Siberian, broadly speaking, Siberian cultured word, the stuff that we see in South America, which kind of looks, if you're an anthropologist perhaps, particularly if you're a European white male anthropologist, looks similar to this kind of stuff. They use lots and lots of mind-altering plants. Here, in northwestern Europe, we have no tradition in the historical record that we can firmly point at, and I'm choosing these words very carefully because it doesn't mean there isn't, it just means in the historical record, no firm tradition that we can point at of the use of these substances. What we can say is that in the witch trials, so in the sort of early modern period, one of the things that's associated, and it appears earlier on in classical stuff as well, with witchcraft is the use of certain herbs and certain plants, and I guess we can probably all name them, belladonna, aconite, all of these substances, very often from the Solanaceae family, so that's the same family that contains things like potatoes and tomatoes and aubergines and things. Lots of this family have got some really, really interesting substances in them. And there is an association which is partly historical, partly poetic, between witchcraft and these substances. What we don't have in this country is that we don't have a tradition, for example, of using liberty caps. So the time of year that we're in this room is exactly the right time of year that actually we should all really have gone out to Dartmoor earlier on today to try and find these miraculous mushrooms. There's a really lovely book called Shroom by a guy called Andy Lecture who lectures up at Schumacher College, and in that book he sort of goes through all of the material in the British Isles that you can find at the time, and there's no tradition of people using these substances. Now, because that doesn't mean that they were never used, it just means that we haven't got any evidence of them. But we do have this association between witches and herbs and substances, and alchemists and herbs and substances, and shaman and herbs and substances. So what I'd like to start by saying is that there is an immediate association, an immediate link between magical practice and magical stuff. Plants, typically, though not exclusively, plants that will change our awareness when we take them into ourselves. They will do something to us. They'll do the same or similar things to perhaps the way that music works in terms of changing our brains, perhaps in gathering us together as a group and in training the way that that we behave. Let's cut to the modern period. So we're all kind of in this room, I'm guessing, because in our different ways we're interested in paganism. Yeah? And paganism really kind of, I suppose, in the modern age, really starts off in the late 19th century, if we're talking about Britain, late 19th century, and it starts as a really interesting emergence or re-emergence, reimagining of the ancient pagan traditions of our culture, seen in a modern guise. So there's a great example of this with Druidry. So Druidry, people like William Stukeley, reimagines what the Druids were like. We've got very, very few bits of scant evidence about what the Druids may or may not have done, but he kind of creates an imagined poetic Druidry. And there's nothing wrong with doing that. That's a brilliant thing. What a skill. And so by the time we get to sort of the end of the 19th century in Victorian England, or Victorian Britain, particularly England, we've got a whole bunch of people who are interested in Indian mythology, Indian culture, Indian spirituality. Bear in mind there's a big relationship between this country and, through a variety of means, the Asian subcontinent, if nothing else by the predatory actions of the East India Company. So we have a relationship with that. We have the emergence of some of the beginnings of the story of people discovering what starts to become called shamanism at that kind of point in history. We have some interesting characters around at that time. So here are three of those interesting characters. I don't know if you can see it from the back there, but any points for anyone who can recognise any of these three interesting characters?
Crowley in the middle.
Yes, we have Alistair Crowley. It's pronounced Crowley to rhyme with holy, not Crowley. That rhymes with Fowley. There's a song, that's a lyric. So Alistair Crowley, really, really important character in terms of the history of magic. Partly because if you look at things like Wicca, for instance, without the work of Alistair Crowley, Wicca would look very different. There are lots and lots of things, just in the bog standard Alexandrian Gardnerian Book of Shadows, that are from his poetry. Yeah? Keep pure your highest ideals, strive ever towards it, let naught stop you nor turn you aside, from the charge of the goddess. It's a line of poetry from Alistair Crowley. So Crowley, really controversial figure, of course. Someone dealing with the difficulty of having basically a really, really difficult and unpleasant upbringing in a very repressive context, wrestling with his own homosexuality at a time when obviously these things were desperately illegal, dealing with the fact that he was born into an environment of deep hypocrisy. So his parents owned a thing called Crowley's Ales, so they made their money by brewing. They were also members of Plymouth Brethren, who are a Christian community who believe that you should never ever drink alcohol. So immediately, you can see why the guy's fucked up, basically. You can see why he has his issues, you know. Then we've got this character here. Now, the guy with the sort of the bald head and the almost as scary eyes as Crowley, this is a guy called Alan Bennett. Now, Alan Bennett, not the playwright, this is a different guy. Alan Bennett, he was, he trained as a chemist, and he was a member of a thing called the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn. So this is the magical organisation active in places like London, Oxford, Weston-super-Mare, God only knows why, but it's true, various other places across the British Isles. Kind of quasi-Masonic, but quite radical because, and get this, they admitted women into the organisation. How crazy is that? Yeah, so they were wild. These two guys are both members of the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn. Alan Bennett was actually the senior member of the Golden Dawn when Aleister Crowley joined as a young man. He was about sort of in his early 20s. And Alan Bennett was the person who was very much a kind of mentor to begin with for Crowley. And essentially, Crowley, you know, he had a fortune which, in common with most interesting people, he managed to piss up against the wall through the duration of his life, spending on drugs, partying, travel, and having a nice time. Alan Bennett was quite poor, and Bennett moved into Crowley's flat, basically in London. And that's when the fun really started, because Bennett was particularly interested in an emerging field which was kind of happening in culture at the time, which was the beginnings of what today, I suppose, we would now recognise as like the psychedelic revolution. But this is the prequel to really what happens. Because Alan Bennett is interested in things like hashish, he's interested in using things like ether, he's interested in using a lot of the other substances, most of which were freely available. You could, I mean, and it's interesting, isn't it, to think about this. These people were no different to us, they're just people, but they still were able to wander out to the corner chemist and buy opium or buy cocaine. You know? And it's kind of perhaps instructive to think about how, you know, the British Empire, as it was actually fueled by a lot of this stuff in a variety of senses. But Bennett and Crowley started being really interested in the idea that could you use these substances that changed consciousness to do magic? And they had all kinds of interesting experiments with trying to sort of raise spirits and do divination and mix this stuff up with various things. Because they were both aware of the fact that at the time, in the late 19th century, there's this big relationship with India, because India is one of those lands where there are where things like cannabis in particular, and to some extent things like psychedelic mushrooms are used within a number of bits of what we in the West came to call Hinduism. This guy, I mean, look at that beard, what a hipster, brilliant. So this is a guy called Havelock Ellis. Now Havelock Ellis was arguably one of the first sexologists in the country, or possibly the world. And he's a really interesting guy. I won't go into all the sort of details about his life, but he's worth reading about. If nothing else, there's an amusing Wikipedia entry on it. So he's a sexologist. He's doing research into sex. And one of the things that he encountered was peyote. So peyote, does anyone know what peyote is? If I use the word peyote, we can put our hands up and say, oh, okay, right, okay. So peyote, psychedelic cactus, typically grows in places like the southern part of North America, in the desert regions, and across into South America as well. So Havelock Ellis encountered this stuff, and he wrote perhaps the first ever trip report. So this is a report which is absolutely delightful. So he takes some peyote cactus, which is the main principal alkaloid, which is mescaline. And he lay down, so he had a friend with a piano, so he lay down, stuck his head under the piano, and got his mate to play various bits of music. And as he was having the sort of the vision unfold, he would then sort of, respond to that, and he wrote stuff down. So, and you can go and read his trip report. It's really interesting. So it's this thing of people in the West who, and like I say, we have no kind of lineage in dealing with these states, but they're encountering these potentially profoundly different states of awareness. Havelock Ellis supplied mescaline to Alan Bennett, who supplied it to Aleister Crowley. So he's the dealer, and like he's the runner, and he's the consumer. Actually, all three of them were consumers across it. But that's an interesting thing. So this substance came into culture from South America, and intellectuals of one form or another, not necessarily rich people, because Bennett certainly wasn't wealthy, were using this stuff and exploring it, and were kind of interested in what this thing might be. Aleister Crowley, being the kind of person that he was, decided he would take it to the next level, and so in 1910, at the Caxton Hall in London, he did a thing called the Rites of Eleusis. Does anyone know about this? I bet you know about this. Yeah, does anyone know about the Rites of Eleusis? Okay, so the Rites of Eleusis, of course, is named after the Eleusinian Mysteries, and as far as we can tell, in Eleusis, in the classical world, people would go to this temple. The Eleusis probably ran for at least, well, it's easily suggested 1,500 years, possibly 2,000 years, maybe longer than that. And people would go and have an initiatory experience, which would last several days. And it's quite possible that one of the things that took place in that setting was that they took a psychedelic drug. So they took something which is called kykeon from this drink, from this vessel. We know that there's an association with cereal, with things like barley and rye and so on. And the conjecture is that there was a psychedelic that was perhaps prepared from a thing called an ergot fungus, which grows on various grains, actually. But Crowley decided he would restage his version of the Rites of Eleusis in this particular hall. He did a kind of dry run with some of his mates first, called the Rite of Artemis, and then he had a sequence of 7 rituals, which paying customers would come and enjoy. And the rituals were constructed in a kind of using various pieces of poetry. There was ritual dancing, there was incense, there was low lighting. If you read some of the reviews, they're quite instructive, because there are people saying things like, "I couldn't believe it, we had to sit on the floor." And these are Victorians. "We had to sit on the floor like native people." It was terribly dark, and there was some sort of wailing going on and things. Now, those are the kind of reviews from the people who didn't drink the magic drink that was going around. The people who did drink the magic drink said, "This was amazing. This was the most awe-inspiring thing of my life. It was sublime. I didn't understand what was going on, but it was fantastic." The reason for that is because Aleister Crowley had put mescaline in the drink that was served to the audience, probably a relatively low dose. But then you're a Victorian. You're living in a place where the wallpaper is poisonous. I mean, it's not going to take a lot to drive you over the edge. So he did this thing. Did this set of rituals. And some people, like I say, acclaimed them. Other people thought that they were just utterly dire. But what we're seeing here is something really quite fascinating. So you can see, like with the sort of photographs we've got, there's people in rows, right? People in rows. They're kind of doing sort of a it's kind of like Freemasonry on acid, is what they're doing. So although they're experimenting with what later on we would probably identify as kind of sort of trance work, shamanism, whatever. There's music and dancing going on. It's still quite a kind of formalised process. What I think, for me, what you're seeing here is you're seeing Western magic, which has come from that sort of Hermetic, Golden Dawn, quite kind of cerebral, one might argue fairly sort of masculine, male kind of gaze thing, encountering these substances which radically change consciousness. It's trying to kind of make sense of it. And a lot of the story, I think, of the relationship between psychedelics and our culture can be seen in microcosm in terms of the relationship between psychedelics and magic. So magic in the Western world There's all kinds of ways we can talk about this, but if we just stick to the stuff that's going on with people like the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn, Societas Rosicrucian in Anglia, those kinds of quite formalised and groups, we can see them kind of meeting this stuff and kind of trying to wrap their heads around it. What do we do with this? It's obviously powerful, it's obviously important stuff, but how do we kind of make sense of it? In the same way that our cultures try to make sense of these things. We'll wind forward in time a little further. People recognise these two characters? Good see at the back. So this person here, this is a picture by Alex Gray of a guy called Albert Hofmann. So in 1938, Albert Hofmann was working on ergot fungus. So ergot fungus is which grows on various types of grain. It grows on particularly lime, barley, and various other things. So the ergot fungus is one which was known to have a really interesting collection of alkaloids in it. And we knew about that apart from anything else because of things like ergot poisoning, which occasionally happens, where batches of bread will be cooked up which have the ergot in them, and it has very unfortunate effects on humans. So it will give them a sensation of burning very often. It will cause peripheral circulatory dampening, so that you get the blood vessels begin to kind of close down in the fingers and toes, so you get gangrene, or you can do. It also creates delusions, hallucinations, wildness, and Antony's fire, it was sometimes called. It made villagers go crazy, and then people would die. But one of the interesting things about ergot is that because it has this vasoconstrictor effect, one of the suggestions was that it might be useful for women in labour. And it might be helpful in terms of various parts of the labour process to either speed up or slow down what was going on. And there are derivatives of ergot that are still used in that field now. So Albert Hofmann, 1938, made a whole bunch of extracts of ergot, looking at the different alkaloids. And he made one which was extract number 25. So it was lysergic acid dithylamine, number 25. That was just the number. In 1943, for no real reason, and this is very interesting, he writes about this in his book, it's almost a slightly mythic story these days. He said, I had a strange presentiment. I felt that I had to look again at this chemical. I previously just stuck it on the shelf and thought, it's inactive, doesn't do anything, it's not, whatever. So he made another batch. And amusingly, even though he's a Swiss chemist, can you imagine anyone more pernickety than a Swiss chemist? Yeah? So this Swiss chemist accidentally gets some into his body. And he goes, oh, this is really weird. I feel all a bit funny. So a few days later, on what's some people now call Bicycle Day in April, he decided that he was going to take what he thought was the lowest possible dose of this. So he took 250 micrograms. So what, for almost anything else on the planet, would be an inconceivably small dose. The thing is that the active threshold dose for LSD is 20 micrograms. So he'd taken substantially more than that. And this quote for him, so he took this stuff in the lab. He said to his lab assistant, I'm feeling really weird. And his lab assistant said, oh, we'd better get you home then. So he got on his bike, and because the war was 1943, there's no petrol. So he had to cycles back home, gets into bed, drinks a big load of milk, because he kind of figures, maybe just some neutral material in my stomach will help. Drinks a big load of milk. His housekeeper comes in, leers over him, looking all like, he describes it as like a sort of a kind of terrifying witch kind of figure. The doctor is summoned. The doctor looks at him and says, well, there's nothing wrong with you. You know, your pupils are slightly dilated, your pulse is a little bit elevated, but you're fine. Nothing wrong with you at all. He chills out, and then later on he says, little by little, I could begin to enjoy the unprecedented colours and plays of shapes that persisted behind my closed eyes. Kaleidoscopic, fantastic images surged in on me, alternating, variegated, opening and then closing themselves in circles and spirals, exploding in coloured fountains, rearranging and hybridising themselves in constant flux. So he's not having the first ever trick in the Western world by a long measure, because people have been using mescaline and various other things. But certainly from his perspective, he's discovered this bizarre phenomena. Sandoz, the company he's working for, very, very quickly started making large quantities of this stuff. It was obviously a very interesting chemical. It was initially believed to be psychotomimetic, so in other words, it was believed that it made you temporarily mad. And therefore, it would be very, very useful if you're a clinician working with people who were mentally unwell in some way. Perhaps you could take it in order to understand how it was for them. So it's quite a thoughtful way of thinking about it. If you're an architect, if you wanted to design a building where people who were mentally ill would go, you might want to take it in order to realise that, for example, certain types of patterning on the floor may be best avoided. Yeah? Because you would recognise the fact that, as you step over the crack in the floor, the crack is this enormous thing, because that's the kind of subjective phenomenon that LSD can provoke, and therefore you might design something differently. So it was started to be used in quite good ways. Unfortunately, it's also the case that the military in this country, and in the United States in particular, thought, brilliant, here's a new thing, perhaps we can use it to kill people, or at least we can use it to make a truth drug, or at least we can use it to make a battlefield incapacitant that we can spray on people. And various deeply unpleasant experiments were conducted on servicemen, on prisoners, on mentally ill people, on unsuspecting French villages, on all kinds of things. It's not a beautiful part of our history, unfortunately. So Albert Hofmann, there he is doing his stuff towards the end of World War II. Similar kind of time, a little bit later, comes along a guy called Gordon Wasson. And Gordon Wasson and his fascinating Russian wife. Gordon Wasson was a great industrialist, massively wealthy guy, hugely wealthy sort of, and his wife was from Russia, and they were very interested. They went out walking one day, and his wife was kind of gathering mushrooms, and Wasson was really interested in the fact that someone from Russia would gather mushrooms to eat, and it was fine. Whereas in our culture, and his particular, he's an American, in European culture, Northwest European culture, there was a sort of a cultural fear of mushrooms. Mushrooms, you don't eat mushrooms. Like you can eat button mushrooms. They're basically everything else is poisonous and kill you dead. So he became interested in this, and he developed this idea that there were microphilic cultures that liked mushrooms, and microphobic ones that didn't. And so he became very interested in the history and culture of mushrooms, and eventually got wind of this lady here. So this is Maria Sabina. So Maria Sabina was a Mexican lady, and she was the guardian of the tradition. She was a curandera, so she was a curer, a healer. Yeah, I suppose what we could vaguely call a shaman, if we like it. We prefer that, but she hasn't got a comedy hat in this picture. But she did have the mushrooms. She had psilocybin cubensis mushrooms. And Gordon Wasson went there and took these mushrooms and was completely astonished to find that it was a substance basically the same as LSD. Very, very interesting. And in fact, he actually provided samples from Maria Sabina to Albert Hofmann, who then did subsequent work on them and identified various compounds inside them. So this is an interesting thing. So on the one hand, we've got like Western science rediscovers, poetically at the same time as we're inventing the atom bomb, the most powerful psychedelic substance pretty much wait for weight on the planet, randomly in a Swiss laboratory, and accidentally it emerges into culture. And at the same time, Western culture is having an encounter with South American curing and shamanism, which uses the psychedelic sort of state. There is a world beyond ours, says Maria Sabina, a world that is far away, nearby, and invisible. So one of those nice paradoxical things about this substance, which is both a physical thing, allows us access to this strange world, which is somehow also just the same as the world that we are in, only different somehow. Time progresses on. Recognise that? Of course we do. It's the Wheel of the Year. Brilliant. It's also in the Book of Shadows, the Gardnerian and Alexandrian versions of the Book of Shadows. There's a thing called the 8 Paths to the Centre. And these are 8 ways of changing awareness in order to have, let's broadly call it a magical effect. We can argue about what magic means, but to do something to transform ourselves and perhaps our relationships with the world and whatever. So a transformative, changing process. So the 8 ways to the centre. So what have we got there? So we've got things like the great rite, so sex, spells and rites. So things like we can talk about things like chanting. We can talk about the different, by knot of 1 the spell is done, by knot of 2 it cometh true, by knot of 3, etc. That kind of thing. Yeah? Scourging. So quite an important part of certainly the Gardnerian version of the craft was this idea of using ritual scourging. And there's various ways of kind of doing that. It's the hardcore BDSM version, and there's also the kind of the light, this is a trance induction technique. Basically any technique that involves inducing trance in people involves taking a stimulus and repeating it and repeating it and repeating it and repeating it until various systems within us, and the default mode network and various other bits of our brain just kind of turn themselves off or down, and we reach a place where we have lots of, it depends on what system we're using, but theta waves, for example, where we're in a really interesting suggestible state, and what we can do in that, the magic we can do in that, is we can put then a suggestion into that state. So we can take a trance. Then you go to a medical hypnotist, what they'll do is they'll put you into a trance, and then hopefully the suggestion that you've asked them to, they'll pop that into your brain, and it kind of goes past all of the filters of, I don't know if I can do that, and it goes right the way down into the guts of like who we are and how we work, and in an ideal world does its work. Cords, restriction of breath, restriction of movement, as well as having these kind of outward approaches to trance induction. We can have all of these kind of, there's quieter ones. I mean, doing things like entertaining things you can do in the winter. A couple of days in complete darkness. That's quite an interesting thing. You get a chance to do it. Practices like that. Practices where, and this is common within most initiatory rituals, is that it's typical within an initiation to have a person and to restrict them in some way, to tie them in some way, or to have them bound in some way, or to have, whether it's literal or symbolic, you stop them being whatever they want to be, and then magically they either, or symbolically the bondage is destroyed or broken, and they are revealed and emerge free and reborn. That's like standard issue stuff, just like when a baby human is inside his mummy. It's all restricted, and then it's alive, it breathes. Meditational practice, all kinds of different versions of that, of course. Trance practice, lots of different versions again. Drugs and wine. Now this is one of the interesting ones. So within the Gardnerian Book of Shadows, it specifically mentions hemp, it talks about cannabis. John Gardner would have undoubtedly encountered this stuff when he was in Southeast Asia. And he travelled quite extensively anyway, we're familiar with this. And what we also have to remember is, we're talking here about the late 40s, early 50s. A lot of this stuff is, again, still relatively freely available. There's a Dangerous Drugs Act in the early part of the 20th century, but this stuff is out there. So, embedded within witchcraft, embedded within Wicca, which of course interestingly has this heritage from people like Aleister Crowley, is this idea of using some of these substances. Cut to the 1960s and 1970s, all kinds of things are happening. Firstly, what happens is that all of these peculiar substances that people are using to change their awareness, they start spreading out much more widely into culture. And so we have, this is a psilocybin fair badge from a Welsh festival from 1979. People discovered, or rediscovered perhaps, that we had this indigenous powerful psychedelic. So the stuff that we had to go to Maria Sabina to be reminded rather, oh, the mushrooms, these are teachers, these can cure you, these can help you. We've found, oh blimey, they're here. Do you know what? They're here. They were here all the time. Again, we had this re-encountering of India through things like the hippie trail and through things like all of that whole kind of that whole sort of movement. So another iteration of the relationship, particularly with India. That's one of the reasons that when we think about perhaps the sort of the setting in which one might take a psychedelic, very often it ends up being something with batik hangings and pictures of Shiva and stuff. It's not because there's any real reason for that necessarily, although it may speak to the individuals concerned. It's because culturally, the best thing we could find that kind of helped us make sense of this was the stuff from India. So the stuff from Hinduism, the stuff from Buddhism, that had a language which actually spoke to us. Well, there has to be said that there's another experiment that was taking place around about this time in the early 1960s, I think, if memory serves, which was an experiment which is famously called the Good Friday experiment. And this was one done in a chapel in the US where a bunch of divinity students were given psilocybin, and then they were played the sound of the Easter service that was happening in the church next door. And unsurprisingly, many of them had profound religious experiences and went on to still claim many, many years later, there was a piece of follow-up research done not that long ago with these people, that was a really profound experience for them. So it doesn't have to be within this kind of Asian sort of wrapper. It can exist quite as easily within Christianity, but when people were trying to make sense of it, the language that they went for was very often the stuff from India. And then there were political organisations doing their thing. So this is the symbol, one of the symbols associated with the Brotherhood of Eternal Love. So the Brotherhood of Eternal Love were a group of gangsters essentially who had an LSD epiphany, decided to give up violence and to make a big load of money, and I do mean a big load of money, selling hash in order to finance the production of LSD, in order to bring the cost of that down to negligible levels, because they believed that LSD would transform the world and would make basically everything a bit nicer. Now, that seems like a bit of a naive thing, perhaps, although there are a number of ways of talking about that experience, and certainly one might argue that it was powerful enough to create some really quite strong reactions by the powers that be. So this beautiful man is Richard Nixon, and in common with the current incumbent of the president of the Electoral College of the Americas, was a total twat. So he basically had a problem on his hands. He had the Black Power movement, he had the emergence of radical feminism, he had the anti-Vietnam War movement, and he had the emergence of a youth culture which was great in number, which embraced various kind of emerging technologies and which was seen as a clear threat. Luckily for him, all of these cultures had some things in common, and one of them was that many of them made use of things like cannabis, and many of them made use of things like LSD. And so the easiest thing to do to destroy these cultures was to simply make some aspect of their behaviour illegal. And the war on drugs, which is his term, was initiated through that process. The war on drugs was never about dealing with addiction. It was never about the social problems associated with drugs, which there undoubtedly can be. It was purely something which was intended as a way of disrupting those movements which were perceived as being against the status quo, which they were in many respects, many respects. But of course the language that was used, and the language we always have to encounter when we talk about any substances like this, is the language of addiction and the damage that those things can undoubtedly do in culture. This is a rat, and people who've heard me bang on about this stuff before probably heard this story. I apologise in advance, but it is something that I think everybody should know about. And the two words are rat park. Rat park was an experiment done in the Americas. It's been repeated several times, and it's really blindingly simple. It goes like this. If you take a rat and you put it in a box, and you give it a lever with water, and you give it a lever which also provides water with either opium or cocaine in it, what the rat will do is the rat will basically give itself the opiated or the cocaine-infused water until it completely collapses, and it will kind of get up eventually, look a bit bleary-eyed, and then do it again, 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 and eventually it's in a pretty bad state. The interesting thing is you can take the same rat, and you can take the rat and you can put it into Rat Park. Rat Park is a nice big enclosure, where there are loads of rats where it can just hang out with all of its rat mates, and it's got like other rats to have sex with, and it's got like stuff to snuffle through, and it's got things to eat, spaces to sleep, and you also give it water, and you give it water with cocaine and or opium in it, and you see what happens. And the answer is relatively straightforward, and the answer, broadly speaking, goes like this. The rats will stop medicating themselves with the opium or the cocaine, and they will just go back to having water, because they're having a nice life. So why would they want to? And what Rat Park demonstrates is something which has been shown in a variety of contexts, including within humans, and the person I recommend reading is a guy called Dr. Carl Hart, who's a really eminent neurologist, and also has the slightly unusual distinction of being a black neurologist in the United States, working primarily on things like crack cocaine addiction within the black communities in places like Miami. And his work accords with the same basic principle, and the principle is this. If you put a human being, like a rat, in a little box with nothing else to do, no mates, no hope, no future, of course there are many different versions of what a box might be. It might be a literal box, it might be a kind of constructed social box. Of course, it's sad. It's not hard to think about it. It's sad. It's going to just try and knock itself out because its life is rubbish. But if you take the same rat with the same addiction, and this is not to suggest that there is no addictive quality in some of these materials, although they do not have other physiological effects, they definitely do, but the vast majority of what we call addiction is to do with context. It's not to do with substance, which is why we can meaningfully talk about addiction to all kinds of things, pornography, chocolate biscuits, being a dick at parties, whatever, because it's all of those are self-medications for pain. Right? That's what addictive behaviour typically is. And if you remove the pain, the addiction, for the vast majority of people, the vast majority of the time, will attenuate really quite quickly. But of course that was not the narrative that fitted within this. The narrative was that these things were bad. LSD, for example, would cause brain damage, it would cause your children to be born with no limbs, it would cause chromosome damage, it would cause all kinds of things. The same story, of course, was tried with things like MDMA when that came into culture in the 1980s. MDMA was going to completely make everybody just have huge serotonin deficiencies, and that people wouldn't be able to survive in culture, which is interesting, really, because we know that substance, along with LSD, is used in large quantity in our culture. So going back to the magic-y bit, the thing about magic and psychedelics is that they are kind of natural bedfellows in some respects, in as much as magic is about this transformation, this change of whatever, ourselves, the universe, and psychedelics are substances that change ourselves and the way the universe appears. And here's just a little quick glance through some magicians who've used psychedelics and explicitly so as part of their practice. You get extra points if you recognise any of these people. If you recognise some of these people, don't you know it happens?
I can't barely see him.
You see him? Can't see him.
Porridge there.
That is that. So Genesis Peorage. So one of the prime movers in a thing called Potentially Psychic Youth, and a band called Psychic TV.
Sorry.
Very interested in the use of things like MDMA in particular. Robert Anton Wilson.
No, he's the only one I recognise.
Robert Anton Wilson. So there you go. Illuminati's trilogy. Then we've got Rosalind Norton. Yeah, told us her. Witch in Sydney, in Australia, primarily used LSD as part of her
I'm making a
practice.
documentary about her at the moment.
Oh, were they really?
I saw a thing on Facebook
Really?
just yesterday.
Wow,
Yeah.
Rosalind Norton.
You can actually watch a clip of the documentary on Facebook.
This is fascinating
If I find it, I'll send you the link.
Yes, please. Really, really lovely artist.
George Michael Bond left.
Is this one?
It does look like George Michael.
Yeah,
It does look like
glasses
George
on.
Michael, doesn't it? Yeah.
Well.
No, this is a guy called Jack Parsons. So Jack Parsons was a rocket engineer and member of the Ordo Templi Orientis, so one of Crowley's magical organisations. in the United States. He used various substances as part of his magic. And this is a lady called Maya Deren. And Maya Deren was filmmaker, avant-garde filmmaker, really, really important, beautiful, beautiful films. You ever get a chance to see any Maya Deren films? She is ground zero for avant-garde film, choreographer, one of the first first white people to be initiated as a voodoo priestess, as a mambo. Yeah.
What was her surname?
Deren. D-E-R-E-N. So Maya Deren. So it's commonplace for occultists of one form or another to use these substances. So this is a guy called Dave Lee. So Dave Lee was one of the early members of a magical organisation called the Illuminates Thanateros, which is a chaos magic group. And this is a guy called William Burroughs. William Burroughs was also a member of the IoT, the same magical organisation. And chaos magic, again, a style of magic that emerged in the late 1970s and early 1980s. It was very much about practice, very much about trying stuff out. And one of the things it tried out was it tried out a lot of experimentation with psychedelics, particularly psilocybin and acid, to find ritual structures that would work within that kind of environment, within that sort of setting. Now, here's an interesting thing. Even though the relationship historically between magic and psychedelics, psychoactive drugs of one form or another, but particularly psychedelics, is quite well established, there are many people within paganism who are really quite uncertain about this. Oh, this is a dodgy thing, isn't it, really? And it's partly a dodgy thing because it's to do with things like addiction and the law and all that sort of stuff. But I think part of it is to do with the way that paganism has had to construct itself over the course of the last 30, 40 years. Paganism is now one of these things where it is, for many people, in our culture anyway, in this, in Britain, certainly in the Southwest, it's no big deal. You could be admitted to the hospital here. We were talking about this earlier on. You could be admitted to the hospital here, and you say, "Oh, what religion are you? I'm a pagan," and it's probably just on the drop down there. It's probably not even under other. It's not a weird thing. Paganism 30 years ago, as presented through esteemed organs such as the News of the World, had a slightly different feel to it in culture. The idea of being able to identify yourself publicly as a pagan or as a witch, in certain situations, would have been much more problematic and potentially dangerous in one form or another. What had to happen to some extent was organisations such as the Pagan Federation. The Pagan Federation, in my view, did fantastic work in normalising the idea of paganism to the point where, now, come May Day, you've seen the coverage as much as I have. It's just even people like the Daily Mail just go, "Oh, jolly old pagans! There they are doing a jolly old May thing. Oh, isn't it brilliant?" They don't really care. Slightly dismissive at the very worst, for the most part. And so there was a separation, I think, between the use of drugs and hippies and all of that sort of stuff and paganism, and that kind of makes sense. Except that there's another form of paganism that's been going on, and the other form of paganism that's been going on is like this. So this is a scene from a rave in Goa, and the idea of taking a magical substance, LSD, MDMA, and going and dancing all night in this transcendent state, in this beautiful environment with all kinds of clothing and so on. It may not be explicitly pagan. These may not be people who identify themselves as goddess worshippers or whatever. But in terms of the human behaviour of this, I would argue that this is deeply pagan in many respects. And one might say that the rave was the way that our culture responded to the shamanic challenge of this medicine called MDMA, ecstasy, coming into our culture. We responded by creating this thing called the rave, in the same way that in the 1970s we responded to LSD by creating a thing called the rock concert. That's what we did. That was our ritual. We had nothing else to go on. We had some information from people like Maria Sabina, we had those early experiments from people like Alistair Crowley, but we had to make this up, and what we discovered, unsurprisingly, was that you needed to have dressing up, you needed to have music, you needed to have other people around you, you needed to have a vibe which was positive. That's what you needed to do. Here's another example of people using drugs, looking slightly different. So this is an image of the Santa Daime Church. Santa Daime is a syncretic religion which is a hybrid of Catholicism, West African indigenous belief and South American indigenous belief. So they make use of what they call daime. Daime is just Portuguese word, means give me, and that's their word for what's more commonly known as ayahuasca. So ayahuasca is it's a beautiful blend of two plants. It is a beautiful blend of two plants. In fact, Banisteriopsis capias and Psychotria viridis, these two plants that come together to create this potion, like a sort of stuff that the witch would have in her cauldron, which can hugely change consciousness. It's highly visionary. So the experience of taking ayahuasca obviously it can vary person to person, circumstance to circumstance, but typically it allows for people to have visions of spirits, let's call them. Yeah. So you can have, sometimes with your eyes open, sometimes with your eyes closed, depends on how much you've drunk, interactions with these entities from this other realm, which are both nearby and yet far away and yet invisible, but clearly able to be seen in those circumstances.
What's the church called?
It's called so the easiest way to look them up would be Santa Daime, S-A-N-T-O, Santo. Daime is D-A-I-M-E. I think it's that way around. Santa Daime.
Got it.
Google it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's a religion, incidentally, I should say, but this is a legal religious practice in the Netherlands, it's a legal religious practice in Portugal, it's a legal religious practice in America, North America, obviously a legal religious practice in Brazil and in Peru. It's not yet a legal religious practice here, but who knows, that might change. This is another type of ritual which is that you find being conducted across the world now. So this particular style of ritual, which involves sitting all night in a teepee, taking mescaline, taking peyote cactus typically, with a fire in the centre. This is called the peyote circle. It's developed by the Native American Church. So that's the people like the Sioux, the Lakota peoples primarily, but others too. This is not the only way of using mescaline. There's another group of people typically called the Huicholes, who also make use of peyote. They have a tradition going back at least 3,000 years of using the substance. And so this is the proto-rave. There's the lighting effects. There is no DJ, but there is a drummer, and there is one rhythm. Speed of a fetal heartbeat, yeah? 160, 180 beats per minute. Fast. Fast stuff, because you're taking mescaline. Mescaline is a psychedelic amphetamine, so it makes you alert and awake, and that's what you want.
Like the Aboriginal beat. Australian Aboriginals do much the same thing.
Is it really? It's
tap,
yes.
tap, tap, tap.
Yeah, exactly.
And
it's that
whenever
fast.
I've heard their music, the backing is exactly the same.
Yeah, yeah. It's very, very much like that. Very much like that. Quite a fast rhythm. Right. So, are you getting bored yet? Oh look, I really don't. Oh, Jesus, that was only an hour. Christ. Right. Anyway, look. Okay. So, last couple of things, and I'll shut up. MDMA, really interesting. MDMA is currently being researched in a variety of places, including actually in a matter of a couple of months now in Britain. We're going to be doing some working with people with post-traumatic stress disorder and MDMA to help them. It's as simple as that. You can use MDMA because we know how it works now. We've got a very, very clear understanding of it. It allows people to open up, to talk about their feelings, but to remain relatively lucid, and it also allows them to do what psychedelics always do, which is to join up bits of the brain that were not previously joined up, so you can see things from a new perspective. If you've got a horrible situation in your life, you're not going to change the horrible situation, but you can change your relationship with it. You can see it from a different point of view. You can stop being trapped in the same kind of rut. And MDMA psychotherapy, which is hugely successful for people like veterans in particular, but other people who've had sexual abuse or childhood maltreatment or whatever, is being used now in this country. And the reason for it is this. So this isn't MDMA. This is LSD. This is an imaging study from 2016 that was done in Imperial College in London, and it's really simple what happens. Your brain on drugs does not look like a fried egg. Your brain on drugs looks like all of the bits of your brain. These here are the areas that are normally happening when you're just awake and around and doing your stuff. Yeah? So what happens is our awareness, if you like, from a brain mapping point of view, is concentrated into these little areas. Yeah? Attention, visual processing, language processing. That's the stuff that works. What happens when you take LSD or any psychedelic is that those main areas get turned down and all the other stuff gets turned up. So it's rather like when the sun goes down, you can see the stars. The stars are still there in the daytime, it's just you can't notice them. So the main thing, various networks here which create what we are currently probably in-ish, because I've not bored you quite to death yet, normal everyday consciousness, that gets turned down and all this other stuff happens. And so literally, when you talk about seeing something from a new perspective, that's actually, in a really real, mappable, physical way what's happening, because new neuronal connections are happening in brains. Someone playing a drum, drum's brilliant. Someone made plants. I like to think, if we can find a good way of relating to these substances, which are undoubtedly powerful and undoubtedly have their problems, but undoubtedly have their benefits both in terms of healing ourselves and healing our culture, then perhaps, rather than trying to imagine that we can stop this part of human activity which we've been engaged in for thousands upon thousands of years, changing our awareness with the plants and substances that we find ourselves on the planet, if we can do that, then perhaps we can actually start to heal ourselves individually and as a culture, and then we can concentrate on what we should be doing, which is exploring inner and outer space together forever. Thank you very much for listening. I do appreciate your time. Thank you.